I'm Tucker. Today we're looking at wealthy couples who built massive empires, only to find out their fortune carried a deadly price tag. From a millionaire couple found inside the glowing waters of their prized koi pond, to executives trapped in a sinking luxury vessel, where their own success is exactly what sealed their fate. It was June 18th, 2018, inside a private mansion in Beverly Hills, California. By sunrise, condensation from the home's cooling system still coated the marble floors around the indoor koi pond, while underwater lights flickered beneath the surface. Empty champagne glasses lined the edge, and several guests had already slipped there earlier that night. Daniel Jones was 54 years old and worked in luxury real estate. He sold massive properties to wealthy clients who wanted privacy without disappearing completely. Everything about him revolved around presentation. The lighting, the imported stone, even the koi pond sitting in the middle of the living room all seemed designed to look expensive and Instagram-worthy. His wife Vanessa, 32, leaned into that lifestyle too. She filmed mansion tours, hosted private brand dinners, and constantly posted videos from inside the house. The koi pond became the centerpiece of the property, with underwater lights installed beneath the surface to make the water glow at night. And honestly, it looked incredible, but the more I looked into it, the more dangerous the setup sounded. They basically had live electrical systems sitting beneath shallow water in one of the busiest rooms in the house. The night before, the couple hosted a large anniversary party with more than 60 guests. Witnesses later said drinks spilled around the pond, while condensation from the mansion's cooling system kept forming across the marble floor. Staff spent most of the evening wiping water away, but the surface never fully dried, and there had already been another warning sign weeks earlier. A maintenance worker reportedly noticed one of the underwater lights flickering every time the filtration system restarted. An electrician later inspected the pond and recommended replacing part of the lighting assembly because moisture had likely entered the housing around the wiring. But Daniel delayed the repair because more events were planned at the house. Investigators later discovered something even worse. During an earlier renovation, the pond's ground fault safety breaker had apparently been bypassed. That breaker was supposed to shut the system off the moment electricity leaked into the water. Instead, it never activated at all. At 7:42 that morning, security footage showed Daniel walking barefoot across the living room, while Vanessa reviewed party videos nearby. One koi had drifted near the filtration grate, so Daniel stepped closer with his phone flashlight. Then his foot slipped. He slammed his head against the marble edge and fell face first into the pond, cracking one of the underwater lights beneath the surface. His arms moved weakly in the water, but he never lifted his head back up. The damaged light kept drawing power because the breaker never tripped. At first, Vanessa seemed to laugh a little, and honestly, I get it. Daniel probably looked like a drunk guy slipping into his own koi pond after a long party. But then she noticed blood spreading through the water from the side of his head. She ran toward him barefoot and grabbed his shoulder. The second her feet entered the water, her body visibly froze. The current moved through the pond almost instantly. Vanessa collapsed against the stone edge before partially falling into the water beside him. Security footage later showed the underwater lights flickering violently, flashing on and off around the cracked fixture instead of shutting down completely. Neither of them moved again after that. A housekeeper heard popping sounds coming from the pond system and called security. The lights continued flickering beneath the water until security manually shut the power off roughly 6 minutes later. By the time paramedics arrived, Daniel and Vanessa were both completely unresponsive. CPR was attempted at the scene, but neither regained a pulse, and both were pronounced dead there. Investigators later concluded the deaths came down to 3 things: the wet marble floor, the cracked underwater light, and a disabled safety breaker that never shut the system off when electricity leaked into the pond. But the detail that stuck with me most is that the koi survived. Even the exact fish Daniel leaned over to check was still alive after everything that happened. After watching Daniel and Vanessa die inside the centerpiece they built to impress people, the next couple learned that unfinished luxury can become just as deadly as broken wiring. It was October 18th, 2017, in Dubai Marina, United Arab Emirates. Warm wind pushed across the rooftop of a restaurant while photographers directed guests toward the glass edge for skyline photos. Beneath the decking, workers had left temporary steel supports exposed along one corner of the roof, and every new group leaning against the railing added more pressure to it. Nadine Al-Hadid was 45 and basically became the public face of the restaurant. She handled launch parties, brand deals, and honestly treated social media almost like another full-time part of the business. Her husband Karim, 47, stayed mostly focused on contractors and expansion work behind the scenes. And from everything I read, both of them looked completely drained during that final week because the delays and construction problems just kept getting worse. The rooftop became the center of the launch campaign. Frameless glass railings surrounded the edge so guests could take clear photos of the marina skyline behind them. It looked incredible in pictures, but investigators later discovered one corner section had never been fully completed. Part of the rooftop railing still wasn't fully secured inside the base shoe channel beneath the floor track. The permanent steel anchor system hadn't arrived yet, so contractors temporarily stabilized the glass panels with partial support hardware until the final components showed up. A few workers reportedly warned management that the unfinished corner shouldn't be opened to guests at all. Rain earlier that week had also slowed curing beneath sections of the flooring near the edge. But postponing the launch was out of the question because it would have meant refunding reservations, moving sponsor events, and canceling influencer coverage already tied to opening weekend, so they kept everything on schedule. By that night, nearly 80 people filled the rooftop. Witnesses later said photographers and staff kept guiding guests toward the skyline side because that's where the city lights looked best in photos. As the crowd got bigger, the temporary barriers near the unfinished corner were slowly pushed aside to make more room for pictures and videos. But what really stood out to me is that a few workers later admitted they noticed the glass panel and lower shoe channel shifting slightly under pressure hours before everything collapsed, which means people were still being directed toward that area even after somebody realized something didn't feel right. Around 9:40 that night, Nadine and Karim walked toward the unfinished corner while photographers and influencers followed behind filming. Video later showed Karim stepping backward to frame the skyline behind Nadine near the railing. Then a loud metallic pop came from beneath the floor track. The glass panel shifted outward, and Nadine lost balance first. Karim grabbed her arm instinctively, but the moment both their weight pulled against the railing, the partially secured shoe channel beneath the glass rolled outward from the edge of the slab. Witnesses later described hearing metal grinding underneath the flooring before the entire railing section folded away from the rooftop. Nadine and Karim went over the edge together while still holding onto each other. Parts of the railing struck lower balconies before both hit the driveway below. Several guests froze while others rushed toward the edge as a valet attendant called emergency services. Emergency crews arrived roughly 9 minutes later through heavy marina traffic. Karim suffered catastrophic chest and skull injuries, while Nadine sustained severe head and spinal trauma with massive internal bleeding. Neither survived long enough for transport. Investigators later confirmed the railing section had never passed final inspection before the launch. Dubai authorities shut the rooftop down immediately and opened a criminal safety investigation into the unauthorized operation of the unfinished venue. Several contractors and project managers were later detained and questioned over code violations and temporary railing modifications. What happened in Dubai felt almost impossible, but the next couple also ignored small warning signs inside a space designed more for appearance than safety. It was August 14th, 2015, outside Asheville, North Carolina. Workers at the Whitaker estate spent the evening preparing tables and lighting for a charity dinner, while heavy construction equipment and loaded delivery trucks moved repeatedly along a private access road beside the property around 10 p.m. Upstairs, glass cabinets rattled softly inside a trophy gallery packed with mounted animals collected over decades of hunting trips. That house belongs to Greg Whitaker, 59 years old. He built his fortune importing heavy construction equipment. Over time, he became obsessed with private hunting culture and turned one wing of the mansion into what he called his legacy room. The gallery was packed with mounted animals, preserved skulls, antique rifles, and oversized hardwood cabinets collected during his safari trips across Africa and Alaska. And based on reports, it looks like a private museum, the normal house. His wife, Evelyn, 54, handled most of the charity events hosted at the estate. The biggest display in the room was a preserved Brahmin bullhead, mounted above a massive hardwood cabinet weighing several hundred pounds combined. A few days earlier, Evelyn reportedly noticed small cracks forming near the wall behind the mount, but the damage was dismissed as normal, shifting from humidity. Then another series of vibrations rolled through the house as construction equipment passed near the estate. It was minor, but inside the gallery, several displays shifted visibly. Dust fell from the walls, one antelope mount tilted sideways, and debris scattered across the cabinet beneath the bull display. A few minutes later, Greg went upstairs to check the room, while workers stayed downstairs setting up. Security footage later showed Evelyn following him inside. Then one of the anchors failed completely. The bull mount dropped forward without warning and slammed into Greg's upper chest and shoulder hard enough to throw him backward into the massive hardwood cabinet behind him. Workers downstairs later described hearing what sounded like furniture exploding overhead. The impact caused the cabinet itself to tip forward onto Greg, instead of the entire room collapsing. Mounted horns, broken shelving, glass panels, and antique rifles scattered across the floor as Greg became pinned beneath the weight of the cabinet. Evelyn ran toward him immediately, and this is the part that really stuck with me. The investigation later showed Evelyn was still trying to pull sections of shelving off Greg while he remained trapped underneath the cabinet. But during the struggle, part of the damaged cabinet shifted again and trapped Evelyn against the debris beside him before she could get free. Fire crews arrived roughly 14 minutes later and had to carefully stabilize the tipped cabinet before reaching the victims. Greg died from severe crush injuries and internal bleeding caused by the initial impact. Evelyn survived the collapse itself, but became pinned while trying to pull Greg free. She later died from compressional asphyxia. Investigators later found several heavy mounts had been attached directly into decorative wall sections instead of reinforced supports. Engineers concluded repeated structural vibrations near the estate likely weakened the already unstable anchor system, holding the Brahmin mount in place, triggering the fatal collapse. 3 months later, the entire wing was demolished after inspectors declared it structurally unsafe. Greg spent decades building enough wealth to fill an entire wing of his mansion with trophies from around the world. But in the end, all that money couldn't stop the room from collapsing around them. Greg and Evelyn's mansion collapsed around the very collection they spent decades building. And honestly, the next story shows the same kind of obsession turning deadly all over again. It was November 18th, 2019, outside Lexington, Kentucky. Rain had flooded parts of the breeding estate since late afternoon, turning the paddocks into slick mud beneath temporary floodlights and exposed extension cables. Stable workers kept checking one quarantine gate that refused to latch properly, while guests crossed the property only feet away in formal shoes. By then, Richard Holloway, 49, had spent nearly 20 years building one of Kentucky's most expensive private horse breeding operations with his wife Claire, 44. Richard handled breeding and public events, while Claire managed investors and racing clients. People around the estate knew Richard hated canceling events because he thought it made him look weak in front of buyers, and that mindset kept showing up in almost every decision made that night. Inside the estate, horses were separated by temperament and value. Stallions like Conquistador needed stricter handling because noise, lights, and crowds could easily agitate them. The imported horse weighed over 1,400 pounds and had only arrived from Spain 3 weeks earlier, after a long international transport and quarantine process. Staff logs already mentioned pacing, fence kicking, food refusal, and signs of stress-related agitation during handling sessions, and several handlers reportedly suggested canceling the demonstration until the horse adjusted to the new environment. But the gala had already been built around Conquistador. Richard refused to cancel after spending heavily on the horse's importation and publicity. By that night, nearly 200 guests gathered beside muddy paddocks lined with temporary fencing and extension cords. Claire greeted clients near the rail while handlers brought Conquistador into the enclosure shortly after 8:40 p.m. Employees later said the horse already looked stressed, ears pinned back, breathing heavy, constantly reacting to nearby speakers. Rainwater had also started collecting near several temporary power cables running beside the enclosure lighting. Less than 2 minutes later, witnesses heard a loud electrical pop near one of the flooded extension connections beside the paddock. Security footage footage later showed a brief electrical arc flashing near the ground at almost the exact moment Conquistador reared upward and slammed both front hooves against the enclosure rail. Nearby horses started kicking inside adjacent stalls, while guests stumbled backward. But instead of backing away, Richard stepped deeper into the enclosure. Conquistador suddenly charged straight toward Richard. Witnesses later said they heard the impact before realizing what happened. The stallion slammed into his upper body hard enough to throw him backward against the steel rail, causing catastrophic chest and head injuries almost instantly. Guests later described the horse thrashing in panic near the corner of the enclosure, while handlers struggled to regain control. For me, the worst part is that Claire ran straight into the enclosure trying to reach him. Handlers were already struggling to control the horse in the mud when a side latch failed completely. Two frightened horses burst loose into the arena while guests scattered beneath the floodlights. One horse slammed into Claire near Richard's body, knocking her to the soaked ground before another struck her trying to break through the fencing. Richard died from catastrophic chest trauma, internal bleeding, and severe head injuries caused by the initial collision against the steel rail. Claire suffered massive head trauma, a broken neck, and severe chest injuries after being struck during the chaos. Investigators later concluded the deaths were preventable, citing unsafe weather conditions, weak temporary fencing, poor crowd barriers, and the decision to publicly display a recently imported stallion with known behavioral and stress-related handling issues. After that gallery collapse, the next couple made a different mistake entirely, but it still came down to pride pushing people past obvious warning signs. It was August 14, 2019, outside San Pedro de Macorís, Dominican Republic. Overnight rain had flooded the irrigation canals beside the highway, turning sections of roadside soil into soft mud hidden beneath shallow water. Passing trucks sprayed dirty runoff across the pavement all morning, while loose livestock cages shifted constantly in the backs of vehicles heading through the area. Rafael Felo Navarro, 63, spent nearly 20 years building one of the most expensive cockfighting breeding farms in the Eastern Dominican Republic with his wife Marisol, 58. Their operation housed imported bloodlines from Mexico and Puerto Rico, climate-controlled pens, and breeding roosters worth thousands of dollars each. Fellow still handled transportation personally because he believed expensive birds panicked around unfamiliar workers. And honestly, transporting those birds was already risky. Large breeding roosters had sharp natural spurs capable of slicing skin during panic flapping, which is why most breeders used reinforced crates with double latches. Workers later said one rooster had already become unusually aggressive during transport. That Thursday, the Navarros planned to deliver the bird personally to a buyer outside Santo Domingo. After heavy rain flooded nearby roads, one worker reportedly warned Felo about damage on the crate latch, but he loaded the rooster anyway. Witnesses later said the bird already sounded aggressive before departure, repeatedly slamming against the crate as the SUV left around 10:40 that morning. About 20 minutes into the drive, the latch partially failed. Investigators later found bent metal around the crate door consistent with repeated impacts from inside. At some point, the rooster forced itself loose into the rear passenger area and started flapping violently between the seats. A motorcycle rider behind the SUV later said the vehicle began swerving, while Felo twisted backward with one hand off the wheel trying to grab the bird. And honestly, this is the part where the entire business they built seemed to take over Felo's decision-making. That rooster was worth thousands of dollars, and witnesses later believed he stayed focused on controlling the bird for just a few seconds too long, instead of fully correcting the SUV. Then the vehicle crossed onto the muddy shoulder. Tire marks later showed Felo sharply overcorrected left before losing traction completely. The SUV spun across the roadway, smashed through a weak concrete embankment, and rolled into a flooded irrigation canal nearly 8 feet deep. The passenger side struck submerged concrete hard enough to jam both front doors. Muddy canal water rushed through the shattered windows as the SUV rolled onto its side and began sinking deeper into the canal. Several sugarcane workers nearby ran toward the crash after hearing the impact. Witnesses later said the SUV remained briefly visible near the embankment, while Rafael and Marisol struggled inside as water filled the cabin. For me, this is the worst part of the case. Workers stood only yards away watching the couple trapped inside the SUV as the canal filled faster than anyone could help. Witnesses later said Marisol struck the passenger window, while Rafael tried forcing the driver's side door open against the water pressure. One worker called emergency services while others threw ropes from the embankment, but within less than a minute, the SUV fully submerged. Rescue crews arrived several minutes later, though strong current and unstable mud delayed recovery. Divers recovered the SUV nearly an hour later with Rafael and Marisol still inside. Investigators later concluded the crash began after the unsecured rooster escaped inside the moving vehicle. When divers later recovered the SUV, the rooster was also found dead inside the flooded rear passenger area alongside the destroyed transport crate. Richard and Claire lost control of the situation in front of hundreds of guests, and somehow the next crash started from something even more absurd inside the vehicle itself. It was October 18, 2019, in Charleston, South Carolina. The Whitmore estate had started settling unevenly long before anyone treated it seriously. Floorboards bowed beneath heavy furniture, cracks spread along ceiling corners, and overloaded storage rooms forced narrow walking paths between stacked cabinets that shifted slightly whenever somebody moved through the house. By then, 71-year-old Eleanor Whitmore had spent most of her life collecting antiques from estate auctions, abandoned churches, and historic Southern properties. Friends described her as obsessive but careful, the kind of person who remembered exactly where every piece came from decades later. Her husband Richard, 74, handled transportation, storage, and restoration logistics after retiring from the commercial freight business. Over time, their mansion slowly stopped functioning like a normal house. Hallways narrowed into tight gaps between stacked crates, marble statues, grandfather clocks, and oversized cabinets. Some upstairs floors had already started bowing visibly, especially near the study where heavier religious artifacts and furniture were stored. And honestly, old homes can hide structural problems for years until one bad moment pushes everything past the limit. That Friday afternoon, a private collector from Atlanta arrived to inspect several carved saints Eleanor had finally agreed to sell after maintenance costs became harder to manage. Richard had reportedly argued with Eleanor for years about the weight inside the study and warned her repeatedly that the upstairs flooring was no longer safe. Earlier that same morning, he noticed another widening crack near the study entrance and suggested canceling the meeting entirely, but preparations continued anyway. The study had become one of the most overloaded rooms in the mansion, packed with tall cabinets, marble statues, and wooden crates filled with antiques. Richard immediately ran back toward the study, while cabinets and shelves slammed into each other inside. Witnesses later said he was yelling for Eleanor to get out before he reached the doorway. But by then, the room was already collapsing inward around her. Investigators later believed Eleanor was still alive beneath the first layer of debris because responders initially heard movement inside the room. Richard forced himself partially inside anyway, climbing over shattered mirrors, broken drawers, and fallen furniture, while parts of the floor continued collapsing underneath him. And this is the part that feels impossible to picture once you imagine it happening in real time. Then the weakened floor finally gave way beneath the combined weight of the antiques, cabinets, and both victims. Several marble statues and stacked cabinets crashed directly into the collapsed section, burying Richard almost instantly, while debris continued falling around them. Investigators later said several weakened floor joists failed under the excessive weight, causing part of the study floor to collapse directly into the room below. Fire crews arrived roughly 14 minutes later, but had to back away after furniture and debris continued shifting inside the mansion. Rescue teams spent nearly 2 days dismantling the study piece by piece before finally reaching both bodies beneath collapsed wood, marble, and broken glass. The post-mortem examination later concluded both victims died from crush injuries and compressional asphyxia after the debris pinned their chests beneath the collapse. Investigators later determined the study floor had been carrying several times its intended weight for years. The final report blamed long-term overloading, weakened flooring, and unstable furniture stacking. After the collapse, most of the collection was auctioned off during the estate investigation. For me, the worst part of this case is the fact that Eleanor and Richard spent nearly 40 years building it, and in the end, it collapsed on top of them. Watching Rafael risk everything over a single expensive rooster reminded me how quickly wealth can turn into obsession, and the next couple spent decades surrounding themselves with possessions that literally buried them alive. It was November 18, 2021, off the coast of Phuket, Thailand. Rain hammered the marina while waves repeatedly slammed the transfer boat sideways against the dock, hard enough to snap the boarding ramp loose twice. Staff kept rushing passengers aboard anyway, as seawater washed across the pier and wind pushed visibility farther out into darkness. By then, 63-year-old Siraporn Vachirakul had spent decades teaching wealthy clients how to prepare for disasters. She became one of Thailand's best-known insurance executives through seminars about financial risk and catastrophic loss. Her husband, Anand, 66, managed most of their investments and business accounts. Together, they lived the same luxury lifestyle Siraporn advised clients to protect. That night, they were heading to a private executive dinner roughly 20 minutes offshore near Phuket. The shuttle boat was a fast enclosed fiberglass vessel, commonly used for short resort transfers between islands. The rear passenger cabin sat lower than the outer deck, which meant flooding could trap water inside quickly if the hull or electrical system failed. Honestly, that detail sounded minor at first, but it ended up deciding who escaped and who didn't. Weather conditions had already started getting worse before departure. Coast Guard advisories warned smaller private boats about reduced visibility and stronger wind from a developing storm farther west. Several guests reportedly considered staying behind after watching waves repeatedly slam against the dock supports. But the crossing continued anyway because the route was considered routine. Anand reportedly asked a crew member whether conditions would still be safe for the return trip later that night. Survivors later said the answer sounded uncertain, but reassuring enough to keep everyone boarding. Siriporn and Anand sat near the rear cabin, while another executive filmed rain hitting the windows under the still-lit cabin interior for social media. About halfway through the crossing, witnesses said the boat suddenly lifted hard on one side before slamming downward, with a violent cracking sound beneath the hull. Investigators later determined the vessel struck partially submerged driftwood, carried offshore by inland flooding. The impact ruptured part of the forward bilge compartment and damaged wiring beneath the cabin floor. Seconds later, the passenger cabin lights failed completely. Anand was thrown into a steel support frame hard enough to fracture several ribs, while Siriporn struck the rear seating partition and collapsed unconscious near the floor. Passengers closer to the exits escaped first while seawater rushed into the lower compartment within seconds. One surviving executive used a cell phone flashlight, while crew members attempted emergency radio calls outside. The rear sliding cabin door only opened part way before jamming as the hull tilted lower into the water. And this is the part that stayed with me most. Survivors later said they could hear Anand slamming his shoulder against the damaged door while trying to pull Siriporn upward. As water climbed through the cabin, people outside could hear him struggling, but the door never opened. Every wave pushed the rear of the boat lower into the water. Less than 10 minutes after impact, the vessel rolled sharply left and sank stern first, though parts of the overturned hull remained visible while rescue boats were still en route. Crews arrived roughly 23 minutes after the distress call and recovered Siriporn and Anand from the submerged rear cabin shortly before midnight. The post-mortem later confirmed both died from drowning. Anand also suffered multiple rib fractures and severe chest injuries, while Siriporn sustained major head trauma that likely rendered her unconscious early in the flooding. But the final detail makes this whole story even harder to process. Investigators later discovered the trip had been organized outside the company's official travel system, so emergency coverage never activated. Relatives also found Siriporn's own life insurance policy had quietly lapsed more than a year earlier, after payment notices stopped reaching them.